Hi, I'm Randy Dunn, and I'm going to be doing a quick little talk for this course on assessments in special education. And this is really meant to be an overview, although I put a lot of stuff in here. I'm going to kind of skirt across the top and think of it as throwing a little pebble across the top of some water. So we're not going to get deep on anything, but we want to try to cover some of the broad issues and kind of perspectives and so forth as we go through this. So I'm going to launch into it in the interest of time. So broadly speaking, the first question we have to answer is why do we use assessment for what purposes? And there are three kind of broad reasons why in special education we do. Number one is for diagnosis, and this is often as part of a referral process, which we'll talk about in a second. But we want to try to diagnose if a child actually is exhibiting or has certain characteristics that would qualify them to be receiving special education services. Always the question asked in special education it isn't whether the child has a disability or an inability to do something. It is it impacting the child's ability to perform in school in some capacity? So is it a barrier to the child's learning? And that's a kind of a broader philosophical question that's part of it's kind of the civil rights of special education. But in our instance, we want to test a child for certain inabilities and then be able to address those in via some sort of means of special services, and we have to identify what those particular issues are. So that's the diagnosis part. Intervention is the second. We'll get to this actually at the end. But intervention is another aspect where we could use assessment in order to plan specific interventions. It can be a diagnosis. It also can come up with a program of intervention for a child or for a group of children. The third is for reevaluation purposes. And as a child progresses through special services, the child needs to be constantly evaluated to be sure that they are being properly served. It is possible for children, it's very possible for children to graduate out of special services when they no longer need them. It happens. It's not a problem. It's exactly what we want to happen. Sometimes we want to keep these children under our care for too long, and we're too concerned about them, but really what we need to do is kind of push them out the door. And so the reevaluation process can help to make sure that we're properly serving those children. All right, who administers the assessments? Well, some school districts have diagnosticians that's all they do. When I was teaching in a small school district, which had one high school, one middle school, and 4 elementary schools and an alternative school, all of us in special ed, and there were 12 of us at the middle school, all of us in special ed were constantly being pegged to be diagnosticians. I would get a note in my mailbox that said, I need you to administer the battery of assessments to this child who's located in this part of the building. And then I would schedule time to go get that child, assess the child, and then write up psychoeducational reporting, which we'll get to in a second. Some people are qualified more than others in that they've been trained. You've often been exposed to it at some level, but honestly, the best training is on-the-job training. Some assessments are very easy to administer. Some are much more difficult, depending. Most of them are easier to score now because they either have software or some very clear instructions on how to do so. So it's not rocket science. However, you do need to know what you're doing, and there's some very important details in administering an assessment, especially when it comes to how you speak, what you're allowed to say, even nonverbal communication. All that stuff needs to be addressed, or rather needs to be, you need to be fully aware of it and make sure that that does not threaten the reliability of the test results. All right, the third little group on here is the referrals and diagnostic reporting. And so when a child is referred for special needs, or referred as an issue that might require special needs or special education services, then that's when we start using these assessments, and we write up psychoeducation reports in order to do that. And the psychoeducation report, just quickly, is overall it's meant to be a clear, direct, and objective report of what the child is able to do in that particular area of assessment. It's the audience is really the school district, but it also can be the parents as well. The parents are really more the audience of the summative views within IEPs, or at least at the meetings, the eligibility meetings. The contents of these reports is they often report on overall student performance. How did the student do overall? Reports on the conditions of the testing event. Was it loud? Did the child seem distracted? Did they seem hungry? Did they seem nervous? What was going on at the time? Was there stuff going on around outside the building? Whatever the case may be. Cognitive achievement are the two broad areas where we look at in assessment. We're going to kind of go into these in a little more detail in a second, but we want to report on the results there. Specific subjects like reading comprehension, especially if the child has been reported as they have difficulty in understanding what they've read, but they've got everything else down. They're doing great. So that would be the area of focus for the assessment. A summative view of the scoring itself, and that may be reporting an age equivalence or grade equivalence or even standard scores or even maybe in some cases raw scores. And then start talking about patterns of issues. I saw that the child was constantly having a difficulty in reversing the B and the D, the B and the D, and the B and the D, and they're constantly doing that. So that would be an issue that needs to be pointed out. And it's obviously it's very specific. And then finally, what recommendations the tester, you or whoever it is that's writing this report, would be making on behalf of that child's interest. Okay, the types of assessments we're going to be looking at are intelligence and cognitive assessments. We'll get to that first, then achievement, social behavioral scales and schedules and those types of things, diagnostic and focused assessments, and then finally CBAs, and then we're going to get in at the very end into RTI, just very briefly. The intelligence and cognitive assessment, in this case, the child's intelligence ability is assessed, not their achievement ability. Now, that may seem obvious, but let's make sure that's clear. The intelligence ability is the child's aptitude. It's what the child is able to do as a result of their natural ability, presumably, or at least the social factors and so forth that influence their ability, their natural ability. So that's what this test is testing. It's not testing whether they know social studies facts, that they remember literature things, or even in some cases whether they can read. That's not really what it's testing. What it's testing is their ability to problem solve and work through issues, look at patterns, recognize differences, those types of things. Even memories involved. And so this test is very different than an achievement test. The result is the IQ. The result is not an achievement standard score. It's often split into verbal and performance IQs. So you got that kind of breakdown, and there's usually an overall one. And some examples of this, although this is not the limited list or in any of these instances, but the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler, and I've administered the Wechsler before, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, the WISC. There's also one for the adult scales, the Wechsler Intelligence Adult Scales, WIAS. But anyway, so the WISC is pretty common, and that's what we used in my school district, and it's a good test. All right, next one is the achievement test. This actually tests achievement level across multiple broad areas, and so this is a good sweeping view assessment to use, these achievement tests. The examples at the bottom are the Woodcock-Johnson, the Wechsler, and the individual intelligence test. Don't get that involved, don't get that confused with the WISC, but the WIAT and the PIAT, and then there's also the RAT, and there's others, the Kaufman. But these tests are, they often group together content like reading. They give you an overall reading score for reading comprehension, reading decoding, and reading fluency subtests. They'll pull them together and kind of give an overall view. That's useful in some instances. There's also mathematics. There's a memory type thing and those types of things. These tests can be pretty lengthy, 45 to 90 minutes, sometimes with even more tests optional. It can take 2 to 3 hours worth of testing over multiple instances. You don't want to put some poor kid through 3 hours of testing. And they are for small children all the way up through adults. And they often report an age equivalent and grade equivalent, but they also report a standard score, which is useful in that bell curve type of view. The next one is social behavioral scales. These are focused on how the child functions in environments themselves, how they actually, whether it's at a work environment or a home environment or a school environment or whatever it may be connected to specific programs of intervention in some cases where it might actually be a curriculum that's been established and use the assessment, the behavior scale with that. It often involves teacher, student, and parent participation. In this case, the parents may be rating the child at home. This is what I see at home, and it's actually interesting to line that up with what the teacher sees and how that child functions in different environments, even among different classrooms, and how that child is functioning differently. And when we say behavior, we're talking about whether the child is quote-unquote behaving in class, in this instance of how they misbehave, but also we're talking about adaptive behaviors. Can the child learn in certain environments how to do certain things? It's a performance-oriented assessment. Observations are often the key here, and also ratings via Likert scales, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, strongly agree, disagree, that sort of thing. It can involve multiple instances of data collection over time, so it doesn't have to be just one time, but it can be multiple. And the examples of these are the social skills rating system, the behavior assessment for children, is the BASC, the Behavior Disorder Identification Scale, often called the BDIS, the AAID, Adaptive Behavior Scale. AAID is the American Association for Individual Developmental Disabilities. Intellectual disabilities or intellectual and developmental disabilities, and this is was originally the AAMR, and that adaptive behavior scale is important for identifying children who have maladaptive behavioral issues that would then necessitate something like an intellectual disability label or diagnosis. And finally, the Vineland, which is a pretty popular one. All right, next up is the diagnostic ones. These are focused on specific areas. The choice might be driven by the nature of the referral itself. The reading teacher has noticed issues with reading. It's not math, it's not social studies, it's not language arts, it's not music, it's not physical education, it's reading. And so it might require that the child have a reading test administered. The examples of this, the transition planning inventory is focused on transition types of issues, and so this is more of a diagnostic for planning for transition. Visual motor integration test is for how the child sees and is able to translate that into written. Test of auditory discrimination, being able to hear different sounds. And PALS, the phonological awareness, understanding phonemes and the structure of words. The Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, my daughter at the age of 3, we referred her for special services because her speech was behind. This was actually through a medical doctor, and we agreed. And so they administered the PVVT to be sure that her vocabulary was there, and it was. And so it was really oral expression. It was not an issue of vocabulary. She had the vocabulary in her head. She just couldn't articulate it. And then finally, the key math, which is obviously focused on mathematics. The CBAs are teacher-made or derived from specific curriculum choices. And these teacher-made tests are they're often very focused, they're very short, they can be 5-minute assessments, and they're very useful for that kind of thinking. I want to see how this kid's doing this week, next week, the week after, and it's really good for small interventions that result, making adjustments to overall instruction in order to meet the needs of the child. It provides a great view of child's progress over time. So as an example, if we looked at achievement test results, this is just an example of this. You might look at 1 point at the beginning of the year, at the first month, and 1 point at the end of the year, at the 10th month, and that's all you got at the beginning and at the end. That's all you have is an annual progress. But over time, using CBAs once a month or once a week or whatever it might be, you can have a much clearer indication of progress. If I am teaching this child and I started at point A and I ended at point B, that's a great slant right there. That's not bad. But if I started at point A and ended up at point B and I didn't realize till the end of the year that the child was really just slightly above point A, then I didn't make a lot of good progress. These small curriculum-based assessments can be very useful for that. The only thing I'll mention here for CBAs is the RTI, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on RTI. I just want to give just a quick note on it. RTI is a response to intervention, and the CBA is often the method for assessment in RTIs. So if we administer an overall assessment for the child or as part of a group, and I'm going to go ahead and go through, yeah, I have it. It may address issues related to the overall school, the overall body, but it also may be related to that specific child. In the case of RTI, we often are looking at the overall student body, and it's addressing deficit delays and atypical issues related to behaviors, to academic achievement, even to certain performance abilities. It's often beyond special education in that we're looking at the entire student body. RTI is not just a buzzword, it's actually kind of a trajectory we need to be aware of. And there you go. That's assessment in a nutshell. Hope you enjoyed it. Best of luck with your studies.